I want to start today's show by speaking about tradition. In specific, the great traditions in pro wrestling. Throughout the history of pro wrestling, we've seen some great traditions take hold. And that history and those traditions are often the things that bring us back or keep us invested in this silly little hobby that we all enjoy. Traditions like in Mexico, in the world of lucha libre, where when two wrestlers have had enough of one another, they go mano y mano, and in a puestas match, mask versus mask. The ultimate indignity to defeat a man and force him to remove his mask, thus revealing his identity for all to see. Perhaps the most famous mask match in Mexico, and the one that you're thinking about, is El Santo versus Black Shadow in 1952. Or maybe something a little more modern, like Atlantis taking the mask of Villano 3 in 2000 in what was the consensus runaway match of the year in pro wrestling. Or maybe you're thinking of one of the other great mask matches before or since that we've seen over the years. I think we could all agree that lucha libre mask versus mask matches would qualify as one of the greatest traditions in pro wrestling. You think about Japan. Many great traditions in the world of Puroresu. Whether it's the All Japan Champion Carnival or the great legacy of the tag team and trios matches in 1990s All Japan. Maybe you're thinking of the great Holy Demon Army versus Kenta Kobashi and Mitsuharu Misawa match from 6/9/95. Instant recall of the date. Perhaps the 1992 Dan Kroffat and Doug Furness versus Kobashi and Kikuchi match, which some consider not just the greatest tag team match of all time, but maybe the greatest match of all time, period. There was great tradition in All Japan in the 90s with those Carnival tournaments and the Real World Tag League tournaments and the great tag team matches of the era. In New Japan, known for decades for their great junior divisions, the tradition of great junior action, whether it's the best of the Super Junior tournaments, the Super J Cups they hosted, from the 80s right on through to today. Whether it was Tiger Mask and Dynamite Kid, or Hiromu Takahashi in 2023, and all points in between, Jushin Thunder Liger, Will Ospreay, you go right down the line. New Japan has many great traditions. The G1 Climax tournament, which is happening right now, and all of the great classic G1 finals over the years, and all of the great classic G1 matches during the latest golden era of the company in the 2010s. Whether it's the Kenny Omega Tetsuya Naito classics or the greatest modern G1 wrestler, Tomohiro Ishii, and his bevy of 4-star matches in the tournament. The G1 is not just one of New Japan's greatest traditions, it's one of pro wrestling's greatest traditions. Stateside. Perhaps you're an old school WCW fan. Perhaps you go back all the way to the 80s when Starrcade and the Great American Bash were yearly traditions. The Great American Bash tours, which burned through the South, bringing all the stars of Jim Crockett Promotions to your town. Years later, during the Nitro era, the WCW Cruiserweights became a great tradition, often opening up the show So many great pay-per-view matches like Rey Mysterio Jr. versus Eddie Guerrero at Halloween Havoc. Maybe you grew up in the Northeast with the WWF. And after a long day of football and turkey, you settled down on the couch for the Thanksgiving night tradition, the Survivor Series. WWE has many great traditions that continue to this day, with the Royal Rumble winner receiving a world title shot at WrestleMania. A tradition now decades in the making that fans all over the world look forward to each and every year. So many great traditions in pro wrestling. How many have I left out? I don't have time to mention them all. AEW is a burgeoning young company, planting its stake in the world of pro wrestling over the last 4 years since its inception in 2019. And AEW is building traditions too. There are many great traditions bubbling up in AEW. I would argue that the Blood and Guts match has become a yearly television tradition. I'd say the Forbidden Door has now become something of a tradition. The yearly Grand Slam shows at Arthur Ashe Stadium are something unique to the company that fans look forward to. And they have slowly been building that tradition. And of course, how can we not mention perhaps the grandest tradition of them all? In the lineage of mask versus mask matches in Mexico, or the great tournaments that dot the yearly calendars in the Japanese promotions, and in the lineage of so many of the great, grand pro wrestling traditions that we've seen in the United States, and with AEW itself, I would be deeply remiss if I did not mention AEW women's four-way matches. I'm sure your mind is full, reminiscing and thinking of all of the great AEW women's four-way matches over the years that have helped carve and shape the fabric of the company itself. Perhaps you're thinking about, from AEW Dark Number 4, Emi Sakura versus The Bunny versus Penelope Ford versus Sadie Gibbs. Who could forget? On Dynamite number 21, when Hikaru Shida defeated Big Swole, Shanna, and Yuka Sakazaki, all the stars, in what was one of the foundation AEW Women's Division four-way matches that set the stage for this great tradition we will see continue at Wembley Stadium. Maybe you're thinking to yourself, Joe, let's not forget from the May 13th, 2020 Dynamite, when Hikaru Shida took on Britt Baker, Chris Statlander, and Penelope Ford. Or maybe you were at the House Rules tour on June 3rd, 2023 to witness history when Toni Storm defeated Anna Jay, Britt Baker, and Sky Blue. Maybe you're saying, all right, Joe, I know what you're doing here. You're not being entirely fair. You're not naming the most famous AEW four-way women's matches. The ones that have truly helped carve out this tradition. As Excalibur explained to us last night on Dynamite, this great tradition. And you're right. Maybe I'm being a little disingenuous. I probably should talk about All Out 2020. When Toni Storm took on Britt Baker, Hikaru Shida, and Jamie Hayter. An all-time classic that came in at 6.75 on Cage Match. 3 stars from Dave Meltzer, the world's easiest star grader. All right, maybe that one wasn't so hot. How about Double or Nothing 2019? Surely we all remember that one when Britt Baker took on Awesome Kong, Kylie Ray, and Nyla Rose. Pay-per-view action, paving the road for the tradition that we see today. 4.67 on Cage Match. By far, the lowest rated match on the show. What about Grand Slam 2022 when Toni Storm took on Athena, Britt Baker, and Serena Deeb in a women's title match? 5.87 on Cage Match. By far, the lowest rated match on the show. Look, here's the thing. You can't put together a video package and tell your audience that you're continuing some great tradition when nobody in your audience, 0 people, yes, I'm willing to bet 0 people in your audience ever thought about or considered women's 4-way matches any kind of tradition or legacy match in the history of your company. And by doing so, and by putting together a video package of matches that nobody holds any reverence for or even remembers to begin with, because I can tell you that I have watched nearly every match in the history of this company, with the exception of some darks, and have reviewed the vast majority of those matches, and I could not think of a single women's 4-way match where I could remember all 4 participants and what happened in the bout. And I know I'm not alone. And you cannot tell your audience that there is some great tradition when it comes to these matches when you have done nothing to earn saying that these matches are some great tradition. And the audience sees through that, and it's insulting. None of these matches were ever great. None of these matches were ever historically significant. None of these matches, I would argue, were even memorable. And those are the ingredients you need to form a tradition. And as I stated earlier, AEW is cobbling together some fine traditions and some things that may stand the test of time and become legitimate traditions. 4-way women's matches are not one of them. And you're not fooling anyone. And in fact, I would argue the opposite by pushing the idea that 4-way women's matches are some sort of tradition in this company. You're doing more to insult your audience and put them off than to help turn these things into any kind of tradition, because you can't force these things. The quality and the history and the historical significance has to be there. And 4-way women's matches in this company have none of it. And I'm going to tell you what this looks like. And as my listeners know, I am not one of these people who is constantly hand-wringing, complaining, and whining about the quality and care put into the AEW's women's division. That is not me. That has never been me. Quite frankly, they could abolish their women's division tomorrow and it would be no skin off of my back. In fact, I think it would improve the overall discourse around this company if we didn't have to listen to any more tiresome, exhausting, boorish, and awful, non-stop, circular discussions surrounding this division. If I'm being honest with you, I can live without that pretty easily. But you are doing yourself no favors with the fans and the pundits who do think that you don't put any care or effort into the women's division, and that the women's division is not booked well, or that it's flat out booked poorly, or that it's booked with no care or no effort. You're doing yourself no favors with these people when you put together another lazy, effortless, 4-way match for the biggest show that you're ever going to hold, and potentially the biggest pro wrestling show of all time. Because do you know what it looks like? I'm going to tell you what this looks like. It looks like you're just cramming all of the women into one low-effort match. It looks like one of the 37 people that Tony Khan now has advising him on creative came up with an idea to just throw all the broads in one match, maybe give Willow a match on the buy-in, and then wipe your hands clean and call it a day. That's what it looks like. That's how it comes across. Especially when you try to wrap it in some package that this is some grand tradition in the company. Nobody is buying that. No one. Why? Because there are no historically significant or great or even memorable 4-way women's matches in the history of this company. You have not earned the right to call that a tradition. What you have earned is more criticism that you do not care about this division. And again, that isn't coming from me. I honestly couldn't care less. I think the women's division is fine. But you are opening yourself up to more of this by throwing everybody in one match. A match that very clearly has had no effort put into it. And then by trying to bamboozle your audience and convince them that this is a great idea because of the deep, rich history and tradition of women's 4-way matches that we all know does not exist. It does not exist. The most hardcore, dyed-in-the-wool AEW freakazoid does not think that four-way women's matches in this company is any kind of tradition or holds any kind of legacy. It is so blatantly full of shit that it's comical. And it's insulting to anyone who's a wrestling fan, or even just an AEW fan. We all know it's utter nonsense. I couldn't think of a single four-way women's match. I couldn't think of one. I had to have someone put me a list together. And then, I still didn't remember most of them. And then when you look them up, the vast majority of them were the worst match on the show. And now by the end of this segment, I've half convinced myself that they should never do them again because they've been so bad. Listen, I get it. It must be hard to constantly hear criticism that this division stinks. And worse than that you don't care about the division. But there's only one way to fix that. If you feel like that needs to be fixed. Good angles, good stories, good matches. That's it. That's it. Not trying to convince your audience that you've built some tradition that doesn't exist. It doesn't work like that. Those types of things have to be earned. Those are the types of things that you have to show and not tell, because none of us are buying it. And you're just digging yourself a bigger hole.